What's up guys? Today on part 3 of our water cooling for beginners series, we're going to take a closer look at hard tube, how to fit it into your system, how to measure it, cut it, bend it, and how not to bend it. Need a new home for your system? Check out the new Enermax Sabre. An interchangeable front panel lets you choose between airflow or all show, while the spacious interior layout gives maximum flexibility and the option to mount a radiator on the back wall so you can show off your lighting. The top-mounted I/O features a convenient and easy way to change up the coloring on the vibrant RGB strips that span the entire exterior, and the PSU shroud and included lighting and fan control hub keep you in command. Check out the Sabre, the link below. So last time on this series, we looked into soft tube, how to plan your system, how to run a soft tubing loop, how that ends up looking in a build like this. And a lot of people are happy with soft tube, but once they get their feet wet in water cooling, want to move on to hard tube. Now, the reason for this is almost entirely aesthetic, but if you're gonna dedicate this much time and money to putting a cooling system in your PC, you definitely want something that's gonna be eye-catching, and doing something with hard tube definitely furthers that goal. But before we get into doing anything specific with hard tubing, we wanna make sure that we have the right tools to work with it. So as you guys probably know, we're gonna need a way to bend it, we're gonna need a way to cut it, and we're gonna need a way to clean the edges. So that kind of starts off with your standard heat gun. This is a pretty common heat gun. I think it's from Wagner. The most important part about a heat gun is that you get one that can stand up on its own. So that means that it's got a flat base. A lot of them have little legs or something like that, so that you could put it down on the table and you could hold and manipulate tube with both hands above it, and you don't have to worry about holding it and pointing it at something. A lot of guns have multiple speeds. This one just has low and high, and to be honest with you, the low setting is pretty anemic, so I typically use the high. But if you're going to be bending tubes, I recommend staying somewhere in the low to medium heat setting if you have a nicer heat gun. This one only cost me maybe, I don't know, $20 on Amazon or something like that, but you could typically find heat guns in Walmart or Home Depot or Lowe's or your local hardware store. They're pretty common, pretty easy to find, and like I said, there's only a few basic characteristics that you need to make sure that you have, and one of them is that it does stand up on its own. The next thing you're going to need is some way to cut the tube. Now, this right here is a tube cutter from Home Depot. It's their HDX brand. It opens and closes pretty easily, just like that. And this is what I use for PETG. If you're going to be working with acrylic, you do not want to use one of these. The reason being is that when it cuts tubing, if I could just demo this real quick, is that it squeezes and actually, it almost crushes the tube before the blade pierces through and actually starts the cut. If you do that with acrylic, you're actually just going to crack the acrylic. But for PETG, what a horrible noise. For PETG, this cuts right through just fine, and it's really easy because you could line up your cut exactly where you want with the blade and just squeeze down. There's no wiggle side to side. There's no real play in it at all. So you just cut exactly where you need to. Other ways to cut tube include a saw, like a hacksaw works just fine. There's also pipe cutters that you fit onto a tube like this and kind of tighten down a little bit and rotate a small circular blade around. I do have one of those in the other room too, but for PETG, I typically use this. It's just easier and works better for me for what I do. So I recommend going with something like this. Again, fairly cheap tool, but if you do water cooling quite often, you will need something like this. This was only maybe $20 at Home Depot, and you can get similar pipe cutters. You could actually even buy them in kits. I think XSPC has a cutter similar to this. So that's just something to look at, but make sure you have a way to cut the tube. But once you cut the tube, you're gonna need a way to make sure that your edges are smooth. Now this is a reamer. Now what it does is it actually fits onto both the inside and the outside of your tube. This is the inside, this is the outside side. So once you've made your cut in the tube, you insert the interior portion into the tube, you turn it a couple times, and you can see that it actually creates a little bit of a smoother edge inside. Then you turn it around, use the other side, and this is what will shave down the outside. Now the reason why you're going to need to do this is because a lot of times when you make a cut, this actually is generally pretty good as far as creating burrs, but sometimes you still do get them. A lot of the other cutting tools will create a burr on the outside of the tube. And if you have a tube, I'm trying to find a tube here that has a burr on it, and of course I can't find one. If you have a tube with a burr on the edge and you don't smooth it down, it's very easy when you put the tube into the fitting to actually cut the O-ring. You don't want to go too ham with this, because if you smooth out both the inside and the outside, you actually you can make a sharp edge. But as long as you're just using it lightly to clean off the burrs, this is going to be an invaluable tool as far as making sure that your edges are smooth and you're not going to cause any problems when you put this into a fitting. The next thing you're going to need is an insert. This is the silicone insert that came with our Thermaltake M360 Plus kit. This is for 16mm hard tube. We're going to demonstrate why exactly you need something like this when we do our tube bending. But basically, this goes inside of the tube and prevents it from collapsing as you bend. If this isn't fit correctly, if you use too small of an insert or if you don't use one at all, when you make your bend, the tube doesn't have the integrity to maintain its shape because it's going to be very hot. And when you make the bend, it's just going to basically fold over onto itself. Clearly, that is not what we want. The last thing that we're probably going to need is a way to mark your tube when you do your measurements to know where you need to bend it. And I have this Sharpie on the table to demonstrate what not to use. Do not use a Sharpie when marking your tubes for measurements. The reason why is if you use a Sharpie and put a permanent mark onto your tube and then heat it up, it's actually going to bake that line or that marking right into the PETG or acrylic. You're not going to be able to get it out. Now, I've said this before in other videos, and people in the comments have said, oh, I could get it out, I could use this chemical, or I could sand it down. Sure, there's probably ways to get it out. For the most part, though, you are going to be creating a very difficult situation for yourself if you use a permanent marker and then heat it up over a heat gun. It's going to impregnate the PETG material with that permanent marker finish, and you're not really going to be able to fix that. So in order to avoid that, the easy way to mark your tubes is either to remember, I guess if you've been doing this long enough, you know exactly or approximately where you need to bend, or you could use something like a small piece of painter's tape, just break that off, put it where you need to make the bend, and then that's easily peeled off once you do what you need to do with the tube. But with that being said, I definitely want to get into what to do and what not to do. Once you have your loop planned out, you know which bends you need to make, and you want to start bending. So I have over here a lot of failed bends. This is collected over, years of doing water cooling systems. Failures happen. You're gonna have to learn to be patient when you're doing this. You will mess up. I definitely recommend ordering at least twice as much tubing as you think you might need, because especially if you're doing this for the first or the second time or even the third time, you're gonna make bends that come out looking like this, even though this is a pretty extreme example of what you could actually do with a tube. It's gonna happen. You're gonna mess up. I mess up all the time when I'm doing these things. Whether it's your bend looks good, but it's too far or too close to the other bend that you're trying to make, like maybe this was, or whether you just make a bend that's not quite the way it should be. Whatever. Mistakes happen. Order extra tube. You're going to need it. When you're doing your layout for your system and you want to try to do some measuring, this is where things get a little bit tricky, because let's just say, for instance, you want to make a tube. You need to make a tubing run that goes from this fitting down to this fitting. Now, I don't know why you do that. That would mean that the pump is just pumping onto itself, and that makes no sense. But just for ease of example, say you need to make this run, and you put a tube here, and you're like, okay, this is, I don't know, whatever it is, it's 10 inches or so. So if you take your tube and you measure 10 inches from the end, and you're like, okay, 10 inches, just as an example, 10 inches is right here. This is where I'm gonna make this bend. If you start heating this tube at exactly 10 inches and you make the bend at 10 inches, you're actually going to overshoot where you need to make the bend. And the reason for that is when you heat up a tube and you make the bend, you're actually stretching out the material. You're creating a longer run. If you measure this, if you measure a straight tube, I don't have a good example. If you measure this tube from here to the end, and then you put a bend in it and measure it from here to the end, it's actually going to be longer. You're stretching this tube out because of the heat, and doing so means that when you make your measurements, if you make them precisely where you need to make that bend, the end result is going to be wrong. What you need to do is say, okay, I need to make this bend at 10 inches, so what I'm gonna do is here's 10 inches on this tube. I'm gonna back this off a half an inch or a centimeter for my European friends. So when you back it off a half an inch or a centimeter, and then you make that bend again, you're stretching out the tube. You're actually going to end up at that 10-inch point where you feel you need to make that bend. Now, this isn't an exact science. A half an inch or a centimeter is an approximation. However, it's pretty close to what you need, and I'm sure through trial and error, you're going to be able to figure out what exactly are the measurements that you need to make. But just keep in mind, you are manipulating this tube. You're changing its shape and length, and in doing so, measurements that you make when the tube is straight are not going to necessarily be the same as when they are bent. Okay, so we've got our brand new piece of 16mm PETG. We know we have to make a bend, a 90-degree bend. We put our tube in, and we start up our heat gun. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start this up, and I'm gonna bend it for you guys, but I'm gonna speed it up so you don't have to hear this stupid heat gun on camera. But just keep in mind that when you are doing these bends, when you are heating up the tube, you want to keep the tube about 3 to 4 inches above the heat source. Too close or too far away do bad things, and we'll demonstrate that in a second. And you want to keep moving the tube. You don't want to isolate the heat on one specific part of the tube. You want to spread it out just a little bit, because a bend like this doesn't necessarily mean that only this middle portion was heated. You have to heat the entire thing in order to make a smooth bend. You also want to rotate the tube. You don't want to just heat the bottom side. You want to heat all around, because the entire tube needs to expand and or contract depending on where it is inside or outside of the curve. So I'm going to demonstrate that for you guys. We're going to do a 90-degree bend, and then we're going to get into what not to do when bending tube. All right, so we've got our 90. Now, I don't know how well it's going to come out if I show it to you on camera in fast forward, basically. But what you need to do is you need to wait for the tube to start actually bending by itself before you try to manipulate it. Now, the reason it'll bend by itself is because this is going to be a weak point in the tube, and the tube will bend under its own weight. So if you're bending in here, this weight will actually cause the tube to start flexing on its own, and once it starts to do that, then you know that it's time to start the bend. When you do the bend, do it slowly and deliberately. Don't go too fast, don't go too slow either, but make sure that you're taking your time, and make sure that this bend is going to come out looking smooth and with no kinks or bubbles or anything like that. Once you get to the desired angle, in this case 90 degrees, you're going to need to hold it there. Now, you probably saw me blow on it a couple times, that's fine. But you want to let it cool on its own, and you want to hold it in the shape that it's supposed to be, because if you don't do that, this tube will actually have a tendency to migrate back towards being straight. Now, it's not going to go all the way back to being straight. However, instead of a 90-degree bend, you might end up with a 80 or 75-degree bend if you just let this to cool on its own, and clearly that's not what we want here. So we have our bend. It looks good. All is good here. We can remove our insert. And then we have our nice clean 90. Now, what I do recommend when you're doing your system build and your system setup and planning your loop, especially if you're just starting out, try to make runs, try to design runs that only contain 1 or at max 2 bends and keep them to 90 degrees. That way, what you can do is you actually don't even necessarily need to make an initial measurement. As long as you know you're going to need a 90-degree bend, you can make the 90, make sure that it's right, and then you can trim the tube down to size. So in this case, we're going to keep our fictional run here from here to here. And I made this bend, but look, it's just way too tall, right? So I trim it down. I'll trim it down to like maybe here or so, and that way it fits height-wise, and then I'll trim it lengthwise, and we end up with the right tubing run. And that's an easy way to do a 90-degree bend without really having to do any specific measuring. But there are a lot of tutorials on the internet and on YouTube on how to correctly bend PETG or acrylic tube. This, I guess, is just another one. However, what I want to do is demonstrate what happens when you don't bend tube correctly. A lot of things can go wrong, and a lot of beginners do it incorrectly. They take the wrong approach. They try to rush through it. They try to do it maybe thinking that they don't need an insert. They try to hold it too close. Maybe they got an appointment, they got something to do. So if you're not careful, if you're not putting the time into this, then things are going to happen, and you're going to end up with something that looks like this. And this is just awful, and nobody wants this. But let's see how exactly something like this happens. And that's because you don't use an insert. So I'm gonna heat this tube up really quickly, and then we're gonna try to bend it without an insert. All right, so you notice that I did everything the same. I did it at the same height. I didn't do too close or too far away. I rotated the tube, but the only thing is we have no insert, and when we go to bend it, womp womp, it collapses on itself. It has nothing inside to maintain the integrity of the tube, and because the tube itself is so warm and pliable, nothing is going to keep its shape. It's not going to be able to maintain the circular tube shape, and it's going to end up looking like this and completely kinked over on itself. This is an unusable tube. This isn't a situation where you're like, oh, I'm just kind of, maybe unhappy with my bend. This is actually an unusable bend. You can't use this tube. Fluid won't go through it. So this is just garbage. But what we could do is we could trim this off, and then we could use this tube again to show you more things about what not to do. Come on, cutter. All right, finally, geez. Okay, so now we got our tube. Looks good again, right? We're like, oh man, that last time, can't believe I forgot to use that insert. But now I'm running low on time. The World Cup game is on. I just got to heat this thing up really quick. So I'm gonna hold it really close to the heat source, because that'll definitely heat the tube up quicker. And then I could get this done, and I could get out to the bar and and watch the game and cheer on my favorite World Cup team. So this should definitely help. I don't think this is working out. Holding it too close to the heat source is going to give you bubbles in your tube. The tube is not meant to be heated up that quickly and with that intense heat, and as a result, you actually get surface bubbles in the tube itself, and again, this is going to be an unusable tube. Granted, this is not the same situation as a full kink. You can still run fluid through this. However, this is pretty unsightly, pretty ugly. You definitely don't want to be using this if you're making yourself a pretty water cooling loop. You just heated it up way too quickly. You're like, all right, fine. I won't heat it up too quickly. But the game's on now, World Cup game's on, and I'm a little distracted, and I'm not gonna move the tube around. I'm just holding it here while I'm like watching the game over there, and oh, England scored, oh man, and just letting this heat up on its own. Not moving this around, so basically only one spot of the tube is getting heated up, and that's the underside of the tube in one area. The heat isn't getting spread out. the heat isn't circling around the tube itself. So yes, granted, the top of the tube is going to get a little warmer, but it's not going to receive the amount of heat that it needs. As a result, the bottom of the tube is going to be good to go, and the top of the tube is not. So you're going to get uneven amounts of bend. And that's what you end up with. You end up with a kink on the bottom and a flat spot on the top, because the top wasn't ready to bend and the bottom was way too ready to bend, and you didn't have the heat spread out over a large enough area to allow the material to shrink, contract, expand as necessary when you make this bend. So yes, you end up with a kink like that. Again, not a great situation, even though you used your tube, you held it at the right height, but you didn't spread the heat out as required, and you didn't have enough patience because you were too distracted by the World Cup game. Now we got our first initial bend that looks so good, but the rest of the tube is just unusable. And that's what happens sometimes. Even if you try your best, even if you put the time, effort, and care into doing hardline tube bending, the first time you do it, or the second time you do it, or the 10th time you do it, you could end up with tubes that just aren't exactly what you need them to be. You end up with a flat spot here, or a little kink here, or maybe a little bubble here or there. Just know that doing this is an art form. It takes time, it takes practice, and you'll get there eventually. But if this is your first water cooling venture, and this is a series called Water Cooling for Beginners, you likely aren't going to get it right the first time. But if you follow my steps, make sure that you're holding the tube the correct distance above, make sure you're rocking it back and forth and rotating it, make sure you use your silicone insert, bend slowly, deliberately, let it cool on its own, you got a good shot of success. Now, are you going to be able to do complicated multi-way bends right away? Probably not, but you'll get there eventually, and then you're going to have a system that looks that much better because you're using hard tube instead of soft tube. And that's kind of the goal here, right? So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and demo on what to do and what not to do when bending hard tube. If you like this video, hit the like button or get subscribed to the channel if you're not already. Check out the merchandise store. We got cool new shirts in, new logos and stuff. That's linked down below. Hope you took something away from this video, guys. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.